A partnership that took the boxing world by storm. Don King, the flashy promoter, and Mike Tyson, the unstoppable heavyweight champ. They made millions together, creating legendary fights and unforgettable moments. But behind the scenes, things weren't so pretty. What really went down between these two, and how did their bond turn from unstoppable to unthinkable? A powerful partnership begins. If you were a sports fan back then, you'd know Tyson wasn't just any fighter. He was this raw, powerful, unstoppable force who seemed like he could take down anyone in the ring. But the story gets even more interesting when you throw Don King into the mix, a guy who could make or break a fighter's career with a single handshake. And with Mike Tyson, Don King saw his chance to make it big. Don King had this reputation in boxing. He was flashy, bold, and had a personality that could fill an entire arena. He wasn't just a promoter. He was a character, the kind you can't look away from, even when you know he might be a little shady. King was the guy with the wild hair, the big smile, and the loud suits. He knew how to charm people, and he could sell a fight like nobody else. But beyond the charisma, there was something about him that made you wonder if he had an agenda. And when it came to Mike Tyson, he sure did. Tyson, on the other hand, had one of the toughest upbringings you could imagine. Growing up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, he had to fight his way through a lot, not just in the ring, but in life. By the time he was a teenager, he'd already been in and out of trouble more times than he could count. But then, everything changed when he met Cus D'Amato. Cus was this legendary trainer who saw something special in Tyson, something that no one else did. He took Tyson under his wing, trained him, and more importantly, he believed in him. Tyson wasn't just another fighter to Cus, he was like a son. Under Cus's guidance, Tyson learned everything he needed to dominate the ring. He had this unique style, the peekaboo style, where he'd bob and weave, ducking under punches and coming back with powerful hits. It was fast, it was fierce, and it turned him into a knockout artist. By the time he was 20, Tyson had already become the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history, which was a huge deal. The guy was a beast in the ring, and it didn't take long before the whole world knew his name. But as Tyson's fame grew, so did the temptations and pressures of being in the spotlight. And this is where Don King steps in. King saw Tyson not just as a fighter, but as a golden opportunity. By the time King got involved, Tyson was already a star, but King knew he could take him to a whole new level. He was like a puppet master, pulling strings behind the scenes, whispering in Tyson's ear about all the fame, money, and success they could have together. King painted this picture of a partnership where they'd both get rich. Tyson would stay on top, and they'd make boxing history. Now it's easy to see why Tyson was drawn to King. King had the connections, he knew the business, and he could make things happen. But King also had a way of isolating his fighters, cutting them off from anyone who might be able to sway them in a different direction. And that's exactly what he did with Tyson. He convinced Tyson to drop his longtime managers and advisors, Bill Caton and Jim Jacobs. King told Tyson they were holding him back, that they didn't understand him the way King did, and that they were just taking a cut of his money without really having his back. And in a way, Tyson believed him. With Caton and Jacobs out of the picture, King became Tyson's main man. He wasn't just Tyson's promoter. He was his mentor, his advisor, and his confidant. And at first, it seemed like things were going great. King set up some of the biggest fights of Tyson's career. He knew how to create hype, and he used Tyson's fierce reputation to sell tickets, pulling in millions. They were making headlines, and everyone wanted to see Tyson fight. With King by his side, Tyson wasn't just a fighter. He was a global phenomenon. King had this ability to create larger-than-life events, and with Tyson as his star, they were unstoppable. But underneath the glitz and glamour, there were cracks starting to show. Tyson might have been the baddest man on the planet in the ring, but outside, he was still that same kid who'd had a rough start in life. He was vulnerable, and King knew how to take advantage of that. King had a way of making Tyson feel like he needed him, that without King, Tyson would be lost. And in some ways, Tyson did need him. King was the one keeping the fights coming, keeping the money flowing, and making sure Tyson stayed on top. But King also had a way of keeping Tyson in the dark about how much he was really making and where all that money was going. Tyson trusted King maybe more than he should have. He saw King as a father figure, someone who could guide him through the chaos of fame and fortune. But King wasn't in it for Tyson. He was in it for himself. He'd make deals behind Tyson's back, taking a cut of everything Tyson earned. And because Tyson trusted him, he didn't always ask questions. He just assumed that King had his best interests at heart. But as Tyson's career went on, he started to realize that something wasn't quite right. The thing about King was that he was always one step ahead. He knew how to manipulate situations to his advantage, and he wasn't afraid to play dirty if it meant he'd come out on top. With Tyson, King saw a cash cow, and he was going to milk it for everything it was worth. He'd set up fights, negotiate deals, and then skim off the top, all while keeping Tyson in the dark. And because Tyson was so focused on his training and fighting, he didn't always see what was going on behind the scenes. But eventually, he started to get wise. As Tyson's fame grew, so did his expenses. He had a lavish lifestyle, with mansions, cars, and everything else that came with being a superstar. And King encouraged it. He made Tyson feel like he deserved it all, that he'd earned it, and that he could afford it. But in reality, King was quietly bleeding him dry. He'd charged Tyson for all sorts of things, from training costs to travel expenses, and the bills just kept piling up. Tyson started to realize that he wasn't making as much money as he thought, and he began to suspect that King was behind it. It's a classic story, really. You've got the young, talented fighter who just wants to be the best, and the slick promoter who sees him as a meal ticket. And at first, it's all sunshine and rainbows. They're making millions, Tyson's winning fights, and King is raking in the cash. But then, slowly, the fighter starts to realize that he's being played. It's like something out of a movie, only it's real life, and for Tyson, it was happening right under his nose. By the time Tyson started asking questions, it was almost too late. He'd already given King control over his career, and getting out wasn't going to be easy. King wasn't just Tyson's promoter, he was the guy who knew all the details, all the secrets, and all the ways to keep Tyson in line. And for Tyson, breaking free was going to mean taking on the man who had helped make him a superstar. It was a risky move, but Tyson was ready to fight back. And that's where the real drama begins. Tyson was known for being a fighter, but outside the ring, he was up against an opponent who was just as ruthless and determined. King wasn't going to let go without a fight, and Tyson was going to have to dig deep to get out from under King's control. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder what's really going on behind the scenes in the world of boxing, and just how far someone will go for fame, fortune, and power. The cracks begin to show. By now, Tyson was riding high on fame, and King was right there with him, cashing in on every single fight. But behind all the glitz and glamour, Tyson was starting to see that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. He had suspicions, doubts that gnawed at him, and little by little, he started piecing together a picture that wasn't exactly flattering for King. It was like that moment in a movie where the hero realizes he's been double-crossed, but by then, it's almost too late to turn back. Tyson had always been a fighter. He knew how to go toe-to-toe with the best in the ring, but outside of it, that was a whole different game. King, on the other hand, was a master of the game outside the ring. He knew how to manipulate, how to talk, and how to make sure that the odds were always in his favor. Tyson might have been the champ, but King was the one pulling the strings, and as Tyson's fame grew, so did his frustration with the man he once trusted. At first, Tyson tried to ignore it. He was winning fights, making headlines, and living a life most people could only dream of. But the cracks started to show, and once Tyson saw them, he couldn't unsee them. The money wasn't adding up. For every big paycheck, there seemed to be just as big a bill waiting to be paid. Training expenses, travel costs, and all sorts of other charges piled up, and Tyson couldn't help but wonder if he was being taken for a ride. It was like he was standing in a maze, and every time he thought he found a way out, King was there to pull him back in. Tyson knew he needed answers, so he started asking questions. But King wasn't too keen on answering. He'd brush Tyson off, telling him not to worry about it, that everything was under control. He'd flash that big smile, talk a good game, and make Tyson feel like he was worrying over nothing. But Tyson knew better. He could feel it in his gut that something wasn't right, and that feeling just wouldn't go away. It's a hard thing realizing that the person you trusted the most might not have your back after all, and for Tyson, that realization was a bitter pill to swallow. You could say that Tyson's relationship with King was like a ticking time bomb. The more questions Tyson asked, the more tension there was between them. King tried to keep things smooth, keep Tyson focused on the fights, but Tyson was done playing along. He wanted to know where his money was going, why he was always coming up short, and why the man who promised him the world seemed to be keeping so many secrets. And once Tyson started digging, there was no going back. One of the first things Tyson discovered was just how deep King's influence ran. It wasn't just about the fights or the money, it was about control. King had made sure that Tyson was cut off from anyone who might sway him. His old friends, his former trainers, even his family, they were all kept at arm's length, replaced by people who were loyal to King and King alone. It was like Tyson was trapped in a cage and King held the key. For a guy who made a living breaking down his opponents, Tyson found himself in a situation where he was the one being controlled, and that didn't sit well with him. The more Tyson looked, the more he found, and what he found wasn't pretty. King had been skimming money off the top, charging Tyson for things he didn't even know about, and pocketing the rest. Tyson felt like he was being bled dry, and he was starting to get angry. But King wasn't about to let go of his golden goose. He knew Tyson was valuable, and he wasn't going to lose him without a fight. King was slick, always one step ahead, always ready with a story or an excuse. But Tyson was done listening. He was ready to fight back, and this time the fight wasn't going to be in the ring. It's almost tragic, really. Here was Tyson, this fierce, powerful fighter who could take down anyone who dared step into the ring with him. But outside of it, he was vulnerable, and King knew exactly how to exploit that. Tyson trusted King like a father, but now he felt betrayed. It's one thing to be beaten in a fair fight, but to be taken advantage of by someone you trusted? That cuts deeper than any punch. And for Tyson, that betrayal was the last straw. What made it worse was that King didn't seem to care. He'd made his millions, and if Tyson was starting to catch on, so be it. King had his own ways of keeping things under control. He'd offer Tyson a little more money, make a few promises, and try to smooth things over. But Tyson wasn't buying it anymore. He was done with the lies, done with the games, and done with King. He'd been used, and he knew it. And now he wanted payback. Tyson started talking to other fighters, guys who'd been through the same thing with King. He heard stories that made his own situation look like a walk in the park. Fighters who'd lost everything, who'd been strung along, used up, and then tossed aside. And Tyson realized that he wasn't alone. King had done this before, and he'd do it again if he had the chance. It was like seeing the man behind the curtain, the real Don King, and Tyson didn't like what he saw. It was around this time that Tyson started to lose his cool. He'd go on rants about King, telling anyone who'd listen that King was a fraud, a cheat, and worse. But King just brushed it off. He'd been in the game too long to let a few angry words get to him. He'd seen fighters come and go, and as far as he was concerned, Tyson was just another name on the list. But Tyson wasn't just another fighter. He was a champion, and he wasn't going to go down without a fight. By now, the trust between Tyson and King was gone. They were still working together, but it was only a matter of time before things blew up. Tyson knew he needed to get out, but breaking free wasn't going to be easy. King had his hooks in deep, and Tyson was going to have to fight his way out. It was like being in a cage match, but this time, there were no rules, no referee, and no one to call it quits. Tyson was in for the fight of his life, and this time, the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. Looking back, you can see the writing on the wall. Tyson was a fighter, and he'd been fighting his whole life. But this fight was different. It wasn't about belts or titles. It was about freedom, about breaking away from a man who'd used him, manipulated him, and had taken him for everything he was worth. Tyson was ready to walk away, but King wasn't going to let him go that easily. And that's where things started to get really ugly. It's amazing how things can change so quickly. One minute, you're on top of the world, and the next, you're fighting just to stay afloat. Tyson was learning that the hard way. He'd been the king of the ring, but now he was fighting to take back his own life. King had promised him the world, but all he'd given him was a gilded cage. And Tyson was done playing along. As their relationship continued to crumble, Tyson started looking for a way out. He was done with King's games, done with the lies, and done with being used. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for the fight. And in the end, that's all he'd ever known. He was a fighter, and no matter what King threw at him, he wasn't going to back down. Tyson was ready to take on King, and this time he was going to do it on his own terms. The breaking point. Tyson felt like he'd been used, like King had taken him for everything he was worth, and then some, and he wasn't going to stand for it any longer. After years of feeling like he was being led around on a leash, Tyson was ready to break free and fight for himself, once and for all. The tension had been building for a while, and anyone close to Tyson could see that he was about to snap. He was tired of the excuses, the double talk, and the feeling that he was nothing more than a paycheck to King. It wasn't enough that King had taken control of Tyson's career. It felt like he'd taken control of his entire life. So Tyson did what he'd always done best. He prepared for a fight. Only this time, the fight wasn't going to be in the ring. Tyson took a step back and looked at everything that had happened since King came into his life. He saw the pattern, the way King had slowly isolated him from everyone he trusted, the way he'd made it nearly impossible for Tyson to see just how much he was losing. And the money? Well, that was a whole other story. Tyson knew he'd made millions over the years, but where had it all gone? He was starting to get the feeling that a lot of it had ended up in King's pocket, and that realization made his blood boil. So, in true Tyson fashion, he went on the attack. He filed a lawsuit against King, and this wasn't just any lawsuit. He was asking for $100 million, accusing King of fraud, financial mismanagement, and every dirty trick in the book. It was Tyson's way of saying, "I'm done with you and I'm taking back what's mine." The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the boxing world. People had always suspected that King wasn't exactly on the up and up, but to see it laid out like this, it was like peeling back a curtain and seeing all the ugly truths laid bare. King, of course, wasn't about to take this lying down. He had his own legal team, his own strategies, and he was ready to fight just as hard as Tyson was. He denied everything, claimed that Tyson was just angry, that he didn't know what he was talking about, and that King had always acted in his best interest. But Tyson wasn't buying it. He'd had enough of King's smooth talk, and he was determined to see this through, no matter how long it took. The courtroom drama that followed was something out of a movie. Tyson's legal team laid out all the ways King had allegedly taken advantage of him, from inflated expenses to hidden fees and shady financial deals. King, meanwhile, played the role of the misunderstood mentor, claiming that he'd only ever wanted the best for Tyson. But as the case dragged on, it became clear that there was more to the story than King was letting on. For Tyson, this was personal. He'd trusted King, seen him as a father figure, and now he felt like he'd been betrayed by the one person who was supposed to have his back. And King? Well, he was doing everything he could to protect himself, but the cracks were starting to show. The case dragged on for years, with both sides throwing punches, both in and out of the courtroom. The media ate it up, of course, and every new revelation only added fuel to the fire. It wasn't just about the money for Tyson. Sure, $100 million was a lot, but it was more than that. It was about reclaiming his dignity, about proving to himself and the world that he wasn't just some puppet for King to manipulate. Tyson had made his mark in the boxing world, and he wasn't going to let King take that away from him. He wanted justice, and he was willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. But King wasn't one to give up easily. He fought back with everything he had, painting himself as the victim and claiming that Tyson was just out for revenge. It was a classic case of he said, and it seemed like there would never be an end to it. But finally, after years of back and forth, the two sides reached a settlement. King agreed to pay Tyson $14 million, a far cry from the $100 million Tyson had been asking for, but still a significant sum. For Tyson, the settlement was bittersweet. On one hand, it was a victory. King had finally admitted that he'd done wrong, and Tyson was getting some of his money back. But on the other hand, it felt like a hollow win. The $14 million was a fraction of what he believed King had taken from him, and he couldn't help but feel like he'd been cheated yet again. Still, it was something, and it was enough for Tyson to finally close the door on that chapter of his life. The lawsuit left a lasting impact on both men. For Tyson, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that even the people you trust the most can turn out to be your worst enemies. He'd learned the hard way that loyalty wasn't always a two-way street, and that sometimes you had to look out for yourself, even if it meant going up against someone you once considered family. King, meanwhile, managed to keep his empire intact, but his reputation took a serious hit. He'd always been a controversial figure, but now people saw him for what he really was, a man who'd do anything to get ahead, even if it meant stepping on the people who'd helped him get there. It was a messy, drawn-out battle, and by the time it was over, Tyson was ready to move on. He'd gotten his money, sure, but more importantly, he'd gotten his freedom. He was no longer tied to King, no longer under his control, and that was worth more than any amount of money. Tyson could finally breathe again, and he was determined to put the whole thing behind him. But even with the lawsuit settled, Tyson's feelings toward King hadn't softened. In interviews, he didn't hold back, calling King every name under the sun and making it clear that he had no love left for the man who'd once been his closest ally. Tyson was done with King, and he wanted the world to know it. He was ready to leave the past behind and focus on the future, but the scars from his time with King would stay with him forever. In the end, the lawsuit was more than just a legal battle. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong between Tyson and King, a testament to the dangers of trusting the wrong people, and a reminder that sometimes the biggest fights aren't the ones that happen in the ring. Tyson had taken on King and come out the other side, a little battered, a little bruised, but ultimately victorious. He'd stood up for himself, fought for what was right, and finally, after years of feeling trapped, he was free. And so, Tyson walked away, not with the $100 million he'd wanted, but with something more valuable, his sense of self-respect. He'd gone up against one of the most powerful men in boxing, and won. Sure, it hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been pretty, but he'd done it. He'd faced his demons, taken on the man who'd betrayed him, and come out the other side a little wiser, a little tougher, and ready for whatever came next. It's a story that's almost hard to believe, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a movie rather than in real life. But for Tyson, it was all too real. He'd lived it, every painful, messy moment of it, and he'd come out stronger for it. Tyson had learned that sometimes the people you think you can trust turn out to be the ones who hurt you the most. And as he walked away from the courthouse that day, he knew that he'd never let anyone take advantage of him like that again. Tyson's fight with King might have been over, but the lessons he'd learned would stay with him forever. He'd been to the top, fallen to the bottom, and fought his way back up. He was a survivor, a fighter, and he was ready to take on the world no matter what it threw at him. Tyson was free finally, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his own destiny. The lawsuit may have been the end of Tyson's relationship with King, but it was just the beginning of a new chapter for Tyson himself. He was ready to move forward, ready to rebuild, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He'd been through hell and back, but he was still standing, and he knew that no matter what happened, he'd always be a fighter at heart. The fallout and lingering resentment. You'd think that after settling the lawsuit, they'd both move on, go their separate ways, and forget about each other. But no. Tyson had some harsh words for King, and he didn't hold back. In interviews, Tyson called King every name under the sun, painting him as the worst kind of person you could ever meet. You could feel the anger in his voice, like he was still wrestling with everything that had happened, trying to make sense of how someone he once trusted could betray him so completely. For Tyson, the betrayal cut deep. King wasn't just some promoter to him. He'd been a father figure, someone Tyson had looked up to, confided in, and trusted with his career and his life. And now Tyson was left with this gnawing resentment, a feeling like he'd been conned out of not just his money, but his time, his trust, and a big part of his life. It was clear that Tyson was trying to move on, but that kind of hurt doesn't just vanish. It stays with you, and Tyson was carrying it around like a weight on his shoulders. King, on the other hand, kept up his act. He'd shrug off Tyson's comments, acting like they were water off a duck's back. If Tyson wanted to rage, let him. King had his empire, his money, and his reputation, and he wasn't about to let Tyson's anger get in the way of that. But you could tell that even King felt the sting. He'd lost one of the biggest stars he'd ever promoted, and now he was the villain in Tyson's story, the man who'd taken advantage of the champ and left him high and dry. And that kind of reputation, it sticks. But life has a funny way of bringing people back together, even when they least expect it. Fast forward a few years and Tyson and King found themselves crossing paths again. It wasn't like they planned it. These were just chance encounters, the kind of awkward run-ins where you nod politely, maybe even shake hands, but there's this invisible wall between you. They'd been through too much for things to ever be the same, but somehow they kept ending up in the same room, like fate had unfinished business with them. One of those moments happened in 2020. Imagine it. Tyson and King sitting down for a meal together in sunny Florida, talking like old friends. It was the kind of scene that made you do a double take. Was this really happening? Was Tyson, the man who'd called King a snake, now breaking bread with him? It seemed almost too good to be true, like something out of a movie. But there they were, laughing, talking, and reminiscing, like the past had never happened. Of course, people had questions. Had Tyson really forgiven King? Was this some kind of publicity stunt? But Tyson seemed sincere. He'd always been a man of extremes, and now he was taking the same intensity he'd once used to condemn King and using it to mend fences. He talked about how he was trying to move forward, let go of the anger, and see things from a new perspective. Tyson wasn't the same person he'd been all those years ago, and he was trying to leave the bitterness behind. For King, this was a chance to show a softer side, to prove that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the villain everyone thought he was. He talked about how he'd always had a soft spot for Tyson, how he'd never really meant to hurt him, and how he hoped they could put the past behind them. It was a moment of vulnerability that you don't often see from King, and for a second, it almost felt like they'd buried the hatchet. But let's be real. You can't just forget years of betrayal with one meal. Tyson might have been ready to forgive, but forgetting? That's another story. He'd lost millions, seen his reputation dragged through the mud, and now he was supposed to just move on? It wasn't that simple. Tyson was trying to be the bigger person, to rise above the anger, but the pain was still there, lingering like a ghost that wouldn't go away. And even though he and King could sit at the same table, you could feel the tension, like they were both waiting for the other shoe to drop. Tyson knew he had to find a way to let go, but it wasn't easy. He'd spent so many years angry at King that it had become a part of him. Now he was trying to be a better person, to leave the past behind and focus on the future. He'd found solace in new pursuits, from his podcast to his renewed focus on fitness and personal growth. He was trying to build a new life for himself, one that wasn't defined by his past with King. But no matter how hard he tried, King's shadow was always there, lurking in the background. And then there was King, who seemed to be dealing with his own struggles. His health had started to decline, and for a man who'd built his life on power and control, that was a hard pill to swallow. He'd spent his life at the top, but now he was facing a new kind of challenge, one that he couldn't charm his way out of. Tyson even talked about it on a podcast, saying how he was worried about King, how he'd heard he wasn't doing well. It was strange hearing Tyson speak with concern about the man he'd once hated. But that's life, isn't it? It's messy, complicated, and sometimes it surprises you. And in a way, it was almost poetic. Here were Tyson and King, two men who'd been through hell together, now facing the reality of getting older, of dealing with their own mortality. They'd once been on top of the world, untouchable, unstoppable, and now they were just two men trying to make sense of their lives. Tyson was moving on, finding peace, and trying to leave the past behind, and King, well, he was doing his best to keep going, even as his health began to fail. You could almost see the irony. They'd spent years tearing each other apart, and now here they were, finding a strange kind of connection in their shared history. It wasn't a friendship, not exactly, but it was something. A mutual respect, maybe, or just the understanding that comes from having been through the same fire. Tyson might never fully trust King again, but he was trying to find a way to coexist, to let go of the bitterness and embrace a new chapter. For Tyson, this was a chance to rewrite his story, to prove that he was more than just a fighter, more than the man who'd been taken advantage of by Don King. He was finding his own path, carving out a new identity, and finally, after all these years, he was starting to feel free. He'd let go of the anger, found a new purpose, and in doing so, he'd managed to find peace. And as for King, well, he was still the same old Don King, charming, controversial, and always one step ahead. But even he couldn't deny that the years had taken their toll. It's funny how things work out. Tyson and King, once the best of friends and the worst of enemies, now finding a strange kind of reconciliation. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was something. And for Tyson, that was enough. He'd moved on, found peace, and he was ready to face the future with open arms. King might always be a part of his past, but Tyson wasn't going to let him define his future. The years had changed Tyson, made him wiser, tougher, and more resilient. He'd been through the ringer, but he'd come out the other side stronger than ever. And now he was ready to face whatever came next. King had once been the biggest part of his life, but now he was just a chapter in a story that was still being written. Tyson had found his peace, and he wasn't about to let anyone, not even Don King, take that away from him. And as for King, well, he was still out there doing his thing, but the days of him pulling Tyson's strings were over. Tyson had broken free, found his own path, and he was ready to take on the world on his own terms. He'd learned the hard way that trust is a precious thing, and he wasn't about to give it away so easily this time. Tyson was a fighter, always had been, always would be. But now he was fighting for himself, for his own happiness, and that was worth more than any title or paycheck. Legacy of a complicated partnership. Tyson started talking about his experiences in a way he hadn't before. In interviews, he'd reflect on what he'd been through, sharing insights and stories that painted a picture of a man who'd seen it all and come out the other side. He didn't hold back either. He'd talk about how he'd trusted King, how he'd been taken advantage of, and how he'd finally found the courage to walk away. But there was something else in his voice now, a sense of acceptance, maybe even a hint of forgiveness. Tyson wasn't the same angry young man he'd once been. He'd grown, he'd changed, and he'd found peace with what had happened. For King, things were a bit different. He kept up his public persona, the big smiles and the flashy talk, but you could tell that the years had taken their toll. He wasn't the unstoppable force he'd once been, and his health was starting to catch up with him. King had always been larger than life, but now he seemed a little more human, a little more vulnerable. And while he never came right out and admitted to any wrongdoing, you could see that he had his own regrets. The thing is, King had built his empire on fighters like Tyson. He'd been there for some of the biggest moments in boxing history, making deals, promoting fights, and turning boxers into legends. But the stories of betrayal, of fighters who'd felt used and discarded, started to catch up with him. King had always been good at talking his way out of trouble, but as he got older, it was clear that the shadow of his past was still there, following him wherever he went. For Tyson, though, it wasn't about King anymore. He'd moved on, found new passions, and built a life that had nothing to do with the man who'd once controlled his every move. Tyson became an unlikely source of inspiration for people all over the world, not just for his fighting skills, but for his resilience, his ability to bounce back, and his willingness to confront his past head-on. He'd gone from being the baddest man on the planet to being a man who'd found peace with himself, and that was a journey that people could relate to. Tyson also found a new purpose in sharing his story, not just to relive the past, but to help others learn from his mistakes. He talked openly about the highs and lows, the victories and the losses, and the people who'd been there along the way. He wasn't shy about discussing his time with King, but now there was a sense of closure. Tyson had come to terms with what had happened, and he was ready to use his story to make a difference. In the world of boxing, the impact of Tyson and King's relationship was still felt. They'd been part of some of the biggest fights of their time, fights that people still talk about today. But their story was also a cautionary tale, a reminder that the business side of boxing could be just as ruthless as the fights themselves. Tyson's struggles with King became a kind of legend, a story that young fighters heard as they came up through the ranks, a reminder to be careful who they trusted and to keep an eye on the people handling their money. King, meanwhile, remained a fixture in the sport, but his legacy was forever linked to Tyson. For all the success he'd achieved, there was always that shadow, the stories of fighters who'd felt cheated, the legal battles, and the accusations that he'd put his own interests above everyone else's. King had made his mark, but it wasn't the kind of mark that people admired. He was respected, sure, but there was always that question hanging in the air. Had he done more harm than good? In a strange way, Tyson and King's story became a part of boxing lore, a story that fans and fighters alike couldn't forget. It was a story of betrayal, of redemption, and of the kind of strength that only comes from surviving the worst life has to offer. Tyson had been through it all, and he'd come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. He'd found a way to let go of the anger, to forgive, and to move forward. And in doing so, he'd shown the world a different kind of courage. For King, the story was a little different. He'd always been about the hustle, the deals, and the money. But as he got older, it was clear that he'd paid a price for his success. He'd achieved everything he'd ever wanted, but he'd also lost a lot along the way. The respect, the loyalty, and the friendships that might have been his if he'd played things a little differently. King had made his choices, and he'd lived with the consequences, but there was a sense that maybe, just maybe, he'd wished things had turned out a little differently. In the end, Tyson and King's story was about more than just boxing. It was about trust, betrayal, and the way life has a way of testing you, pushing you to the edge, and forcing you to find out what you're really made of. Tyson had found his peace, and King had found a kind of acceptance. But their story was one that would live on, a reminder of the highs and lows that come with fame, fortune, and the choices we make. Tyson might have left the ring behind, but he'd never stopped being a fighter. He'd found new battles to fight, new challenges to overcome, and new ways to make a difference. He'd turned his life around, built a new legacy, and shown the world that he was more than just a boxer. He was a survivor, a man who'd faced his demons and come out the other side stronger than ever. And as for King, well, he was still out there, still hustling, still doing what he did best. But his time with Tyson had changed him too, in ways he might never admit. He'd seen what it was like to stand beside greatness, to be a part of something bigger than himself, and he'd felt the sting of losing it all. King had been the kingmaker, the man who could turn a fighter into a legend. But in the end, he'd lost the one fighter who'd meant the most to him. Tyson and King had gone their separate ways, but they'd never really left each other behind. They were like two sides of the same coin, forever linked by their shared past, their victories, and their losses. They'd been through the highs and lows together, and in the end, they'd found a way to make peace, not just with each other, but with themselves. So, What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.